Coming up, the New York Football Giants prepare for a Saturday afternoon preseason matchup with the Houston Texans. We break down not only the roster moves, not only the players to watch, but also whether or not two podcast hosts can agree on formats going forward. We dive in next. Yes, my friends, it is OGP, the One Giant Podcast, where you know that we are your hosts. Over here, Adam Armbrecht, over there, Andrew Mackwitz. We're healthy, we're wealthy, we're wise, if not entirely on the same page when it comes to looking ahead to tomorrow and the Houston Texans matchup. A lot of moves getting made, not only for the Giants, but around the league, which you expect because you're kind of clearing out bodies, maybe bringing in some bodies to help get you through two more preseason matchups before we get to the regular season. Plenty to talk about, Andy, but how are we, sir, as we close in on a very weird Saturday 1 p.m. preseason game tomorrow for the Giants?
Yeah, we got a couple weeks left. It feels like, we've talked off show about how, as we get closer, we're going to talk a little bit about the roster spots that are actually up for grabs. A lot of the transactions that have occurred in the last 24 to 48 hours were guys that are not going to make the roster or are probably going to get cut. There feels like there's only a handful of spots available across a whole host of positions, but you go into these games and you got to see some of these guys play. Who is going to step up and say, you cannot cut me from this team because every time I'm out on the field, I perform, I excel, I do well. You cannot live without me. That's essentially how I'm looking at the next two preseason games.
Handful of players obviously either released or brought back in here. We'll go into more detail throughout the course of the show and where they plug in. Jalen Mills released, Jakob Johnson brought in, tight end fullback, Joshua Kelly as well in the backfield, and then the Jordan Phillips trade. So we're going to hit these as we walk our way through. Andy, I'll give you one because we had the great debate about going through all the roster transactions or about highlighting who we want to watch when it comes to Saturday. I think that we should care about the guys that are on the roster. Andy likes to lament about members forgotten and things that could have been. But I'll give you one at the top. One move here that you want to highlight that the Giants made ahead of this weekend.
Well, the move I want to highlight is the one that brought a player in, and that's Jakob Johnson, who has come in from the Las Vegas Raiders, spent time there as a fullback / tight end, but spent 91% of his time in his snaps at fullback. I didn't even know the Giants were considering having a fullback on this roster. What I found fascinating about it is twofold. One is that he spent a couple of years with Carmen Bricillo in Las Vegas, and before that was with the New England Patriots with Carmen Bricillo. He has spent his entire NFL career around Carmen Bricillo. So clearly the new offensive line coach has a little bit of say and pull on what this roster looks like. Because without him, Jakob Johnson is not on this roster. But Adam, the thing that I thought was interesting was this led a lot of people close to the team and a lot of the beat writers to be like, we thought Daniel Bellinger was the guy that could play fullback and tight end. This removes Daniel Bellinger from being in that fullback position, which makes his roster spot even more shaky. And to me, that's why it was noteworthy to me that everyone around the team is saying Daniel Bellinger's roster spot might be in jeopardy when you and I have both sat here being like, that's crazy. When the guy's been on the field, he's been relatively productive. How can you just go from being a relatively productive 1A or number 2 tight end to just being outright released on a rookie contract?
Yeah, so this does bring us to, and this is how you blend it all together, baby. You go ahead and you say that's one of the guys to watch is Daniel Bellinger in this preseason game and how he looks going forward. Listen, there's too many beat reporters mentioning Daniel Bellinger's name as a potential. Now, they do say surprise cut candidate, so it's not like they're talking about, hey, he's one of the first names that you could hear cut from this roster, but they're at least putting it out there. You mentioned about the backfield there and the fullback kind of position. On the one hand, yes, it takes him out of that role, and you look around the rest of this roster. Remember, it really comes down to how are you identifying what his role is going to be, because Lawrence Cager's down with the groin. That's going to be extensive. There's no more Darren Waller on this roster anymore. You have Manhurts. Stoll is just coming back. There's not really a lot of dynamic tight ends in this roster. Tyree Jackson, we hardly knew ye. He gets cut as well in all of these moves. So when you look inside the room, you could say, oh, well, that was something that maybe we think Daniel Bellinger could have done, and that reduces his role. Or you look at it as the Giants want to get him back to doing what he did in his rookie season, which was being a pretty darn effective pass catcher, even if he was lining up in different spots across the formations. I have a hard time connecting these two things together so much as I have an easy time looking at how the offensive line has had injuries. We're not going to see the full five on Saturday for the Giants. And you want to make sure that if you're going to have Daniel Jones in there, maybe we go ahead and get a body in here that can make sure he stays clean on Saturday for however many reps we want to give him.
The last thing that I thought about before we get into the Texans about Jakob Johnson in particular is, man, the Giants are really like pushing all their chips into the Las Vegas Raiders run game and offensive line scheme.
Yeah.
Like you hire Carmen Brasillo, you make Jermaine Illuminor your priority free agent offensive lineman. You go out and you get Greg Van Roten in the secondary, the second wave of free agency, so to speak. And then you see a fullback who was in the run game as well. And Adam, it made me just go back and look to see like, well, Josh Jacobs struggled last year, so that offensive line couldn't have been good. And they were rotating quarterbacks all over the place. So clearly the offensive line wasn't good, right? Wrong. I looked at it. They were actually a top 10 Pro Football Focus offensive line. So they were doing something right. So clearly the Giants were like, hey, we had a top 10 offensive line and we didn't have a player like Andrew Thomas on it. What if we take Carmen Brasillo, a few of those players, sprinkle it all together? Can this offensive line be serviceable? That's what the Jakob Johnson thing signified to me, was like, wow, they're really taking as much of the Raiders as they can and hoping that it works here.
Yeah, and I think if you're Brasillo, it's like, how do I make sure that I don't, come up short in my first year as the offensive line coach? I bring in guys that are familiar, that know the system, that can communicate it, and then you look across that line, and these are guys we can talk about watching, obviously, on Saturday, but you think about putting veterans around young players, second-year players, putting veterans in positions that you feel like you don't have a clear-cut answer or depth role necessarily on this roster as well. When we turn over to this Texans game, and we're going to continue to come up with the moves that have been made here in the areas that we're watching, but I had to have this in the A block of the show, that the number one thing to watch for me on Saturday, it is Daniel Jones. And I'm sure a big segment of the fan base is going to go, who cares? He's not the long-term quarterback. We need to move on from him anyway, blah, blah, blah. It doesn't matter. These are the first live game reps that we're going to see from him. This is coming off of his injury. This is coming off getting a little bit of buzz and hype here over the course of camp. And while it's not going to be the perfect offensive line in front of him, it really does matter. Because we always say, like, you can't, stake your claim of a preseason performance, but you can do a lot of damage. And if Daniel Jones goes out there and does not look pretty sharp and crisp and clean with the handful of reps that he gets, the fan base is going to just swell around that and start putting him closer to Drew Lock than to Tommy DeVito when we see these reps that go on.
To me, it's not about the success that Daniel Jones has. It's what we cannot see from Daniel Jones while he's out there. Like, it doesn't matter if he throws a bunch of touchdown passes, because you're going to be like, big deal, he's got to do it in the regular season.
Yeah.
But what you don't want to see are all the things that have led people to feel the way that they have about Daniel Jones. You can't see him skittish in the pocket. You can't see him holding the ball for too long. You cannot see him not being able to get to his second read or his second progression. He has to be crisp. He has to be an athlete. He has to get the ball out fast, and he has to take shots downfield. So for me, it's not necessarily about like, what does his stat line look like?
No.
It's like just get away from all the things that people have been ultra critical about with you, and take those deep shots, make those second reads and progressions. To me, that's what I'm looking for. You're spot on. He just needs to look better than he did in the areas that he was deficient in over the handful of games that he played last season.
Of course. So that's my number one need to just see that looking clean. Obviously, the offensive line we'll talk about a little bit more here as we move through, and who's going to be or not be available in this game, and why you can still get a lot of valuable reps out of that as well. Flip it over then to the defensive side of the football, because we're going to ping pong all around here. For me, Andy, my next biggest watch is the defense, the defensive front, the secondary, and the safety room. Why the defensive front? Because all of a sudden over this week of camp, we get this other little buzz happening, where Azeez Ojulari is going to get reps on the interior of the defensive line. And when you think about, we just talked about this in our last episode, it's interesting to think about who are some cut candidates. Jordan Phillips was one of them. He's no longer a cut candidate because he's no longer on the New York Giants roster. They make an in-division trade with the Dallas Cowboys. They throw in a 7th-round pick. They get back a 6th-round pick in the transaction, and they also give themselves an extra $1.3 million in cap room existing for them right now, which bumps them up closer to like 11.5 or so on the year, which is a good sign for them if they need to make some additional moves. What was your takeaway on the trade? But also the idea of Andy's hill to die on. We know Azeez Ojulari's status, is it encouraging or discouraging that they're now talking about using him on the interior of the defensive line?
Okay, so very quickly on the Jordan Phillips thing, he had obviously lost snaps. I'm going to highlight players to look at
Yeah.
that position. Guys like Elijah Chapman have already jumped him. Elijah Chapman's cheaper. He's younger. He's stronger. He's all the things that you wanted to see so far in preseason and in the game against the Lions. He looked the part too.
Yeah.
Very easy to move on. The Giants made sure to write in the contract that if Jordan Phillips is on the roster for 2 games for the Dallas Cowboys at any point in the season, they get that 6th-round pick. There was they've seen these trades go through before where they kind of release him, but then re-sign him to the active roster and do all these finagling.
Anytime that guy gets on the field for you, it can.
Yeah, you're like, we don't care if you release him 6 times. If he plays 2 games for you, we're getting your pick. I don't care what you say. Now,
and picking up something around 15 to 18 spots potentially in the draft swap there. Giants, we think probably still top 10 in the 7th round. Cowboys, maybe middle of the pack. 20-ish picks, you move up the board. Hey, we'll see if it pays off next year.
Yeah, and in cap space, it's about $300,000 to $400,000 in effective cap space because you're clearly going to have to sign someone else to the roster, right. And that the delta of a veteran minimum there or whatever it's going to be is about $300,000 to $400,000. So that's all fine and dandy. Small transaction, not a big deal. Didn't seem like Jordan Phillips was really on anyone's radar, over the last month or so.
Right.
The Azeez Ojulari stuff. I mean,
come on.
What do you want me to, I'm not the one that said this at the podium, Adam. That was not me. That was defensive coordinator Shane Bowen. That was not me being like, well, he can't get on the field because we traded for someone better than him in Brian Burns. Well, he's looked lethargic and slow in the preseason game and looked tentative, and Boogie Basham looked better. Now they're talking about moving him to the interior offensive line next to Dexter Lawrence so that he can get playing time. The only thing I'll say is this. I obviously have gone out on a very long limb here saying that I just don't see the fit for Azeez Ojulari on this roster. And when you hear Shane Bowen come out and be like, we're thinking about moving positions for him and trying to get him on the defensive front, do you think that says more about the lack of depth on the defensive front? Or does it say more about Azeez Ojulari's ability as a pass rusher or an edge rusher in Shane Bowen's system?
Yeah, it's so tricky because there are some names we talk about behind Dexter Lawrence and Jordan Riley, and you mentioned Elijah Chapman's going to be in the mix. We talked about how DJ Davidson could be on the outside looking in when it comes to roster spots. We saw some Casey Rogers. So it's not like when you look at the defensive, depth, you go, wow, nothing to worry about here. We have so many viable options. But the other side of it is exactly what we know. He's you talk about a holdover player. He's always had injury concerns. He's had a great statistical seasons for the New York Giants, and he's also struggled to have that consistency. And you worry about his motor at 6'3", 240. I mean, I just don't know. Listen, are there versions of Shane Bowen's defense where you want to go ahead and put a little more size collectively on the defensive front, and it's easier or makes more sense to have Azeez Ojulari there? Maybe you feel like you get more speed with different options on the edge. Okay, I can rationalize 1,000 different reasons why you want to get him reps other places. But at the infancy of it, it's that you went out and you got Brian Burns, that you already have Kayvon Thibodeau, and that you kind of know the studs that you have on your defense. You also know some depth players that you have on your defense. And it just feels like Azeez Ojulari is a man maybe without a role right now, and not in the fun way. Like Isaiah Simmons is going to bounce around a little bit, and, we're going to use him different ways. That's not what your high 2nd-round draft pick is supposed to look like as he goes into a contract year.
Oh, and there's 2 other things that come to my mind. One is they're not thinking about putting Boogie Basham inside. You're not hearing them say, let's see if he could play the defensive.
Right. Well, he's already doing. Yeah, he's doing his job over there. Why would we lose him?
They're like, he's running he's getting around the edge like his life depends on it in training camp and in the preseason games. You're not hearing that from him. And you know what, Adam? It's that age-old saying. It's like, if you have a bunch of versatility in the NFL, if you could try to play multiple positions, do you really have a position? Remember, Isaiah Simmons was a free agent. He did get traded from the Arizona Cardinals for a 7th-round pick after being a 1st-round pick. His versatility is a blessing and a curse because it doesn't give him a role. If we're saying that Azeez Ojulari cannot cut it on the edge, that is a huge concern for me. And it just reaffirms to me what I've been saying all camp, which is I just don't understand what his role is going to be on in this season after you get someone like Brian Burns. And I honestly think if he ends up making the roster, which I still think is a question mark, he may get traded, he may get released, whatever it may be. But if he makes this roster, the only way he really gets on the field, to me, is by injury. Like, would Kayvon Thibodeau have to miss games, or Brian Burns would have to go down? Because to me, rotationally, I think Boogie Basham has jumped him in terms of who's next in the pecking order.
And that's, I mean, so it makes it a fascinating watch tomorrow because you're going to say, hey, where do we see Azeez Ojulari? And how does he look? And again, the reason why this guy, I think, has come up here is because of preseason game number 1. We said that when we came in after it. I acknowledged, listen, whatever I thought was going to happen with Azeez Ojulari, he was the least excited or energized player that was on the field there. And that may be a big coupling of how he feels he is being wedged out of his role with this team. And he is a holdover. You bring in new guys and it looks better. And that's not an excuse for him. Other guys are just claiming those roles. So you combine it with a guy like Basham looking good. When other players are starting to look like they're fitting into this system well, and you have this concern around you already, it's not getting better. I don't know. I don't know where this lands by the end of the offseason. Still 2 season games to go, excuse me. But as it stands right now, it just looks like Azeez Ojulari is not a man that fits or maybe wants to fit in right now on this defensive side of the football. Okay. So those are a few things that we've talked about. Defensively, the reason why I think it's so fascinating is because then you go to the next layer, and that's the secondary and looking on the outside. If you're going to watch something, you need to watch Nick McLeod, who's going to get the reps on the outside when Cordell Flott's still dealing with the injury. Not sure what that's going to look like tomorrow. But then you also have to reopen, Andy, the conversation on Trey Hawkins and whether or not we think he can be a contributor. As it stands right now, this is a team that needs to figure out what it's going to look like in this secondary, and it still feels like they're open to options.
Yeah, on the defensive side of the ball, that is definitely the question. Like, who are we watching? What is it going to be? The Giants on Giants.com put out players to watch in this preseason game. They mentioned Daniel Jones, so you hit the nail on the head right out of the gate. They mentioned guys like Wan'Dale Robinson to see his connection with Daniel Jones. They mentioned Theo Johnson. Obviously, we talked about Daniel Bellinger and the situation with Lawrence Cager. They then mentioned Nick McLeod and Tyler Nubin as 2 of the guys to focus on. But I think, to your point, Cordell Flott is like an interesting one for me. It's like, is he going to get on the field before the regular season starts? Is his, like, where is his injury stand in all this? I'm curious to see what Nick McLeod looks like in this game if he gets extended time. Remember, Nick McLeod didn't play at all in the first game. And you and I kind of talked off show. I thought it was strange. You kind of were saying, well, they kind of know already what they have in him. So do they really need to see it? But he's going to probably be out there and playing in this game, you would think, right?
Yeah, well, at this point, too, because, again, to tie it into Cordell Flott, it's because, listen, remember, it was the start of this offseason that we heard Cordell Flott is going to be given the opportunity to claim the outside starting role. But we've been waiting to see that and see it look successful. Because of the injury, if you ask me right now, what happens week 1, day 1 of this season for the New York Giants, there's no way Cordell Flott can be put on the outside because he just hasn't had the reps. Like, he is still a young player and now learning a new system and hasn't been on the field for it. So the Nick McLeod piece now feels different to me than when we last talked about it off pod, where you go, well, I wouldn't hate seeing him get some reps because it looks like there's a really good chance that he could be the starting corner week 1 if we don't go out and find ourselves another option. And tomorrow afternoon would be a great opportunity as well, because you're going to be talking about, you have Stephon Diggs, newly acquired there in Houston, obviously. They have Nico Collins. You have Robert Woods. Like, there are some players, right, inside of that wide receiver core that for him and for Tay Banks, another name to be watching because he's been getting some struggle notes by beat reporters during camp. You're going to get some of the best kind of reps here against these guys. CJ Stroud played a little bit last week as well. So you're going to see the starters for them on Saturday. It's a good test for the secondary.
Yeah, the secondary is going to have a good test again, for CJ Stroud. On the offensive side of the ball, Adam, when we talk about players to watch, I don't have one. I have a little grouping of players that I find fascinating that I want to see more of. And that is kind of the back end wide receiver group, because I still feel like this is not sorted out yet. And I'm looking at specific guys. 1, Miles Boykin. 2, Isaiah Hodgins. And 3, Allen Robinson. Those 3 guys to me are going to be fascinating to see how they're used. Pat Leonard on Talking Ball a month ago said he was confident that Miles Boykin was going to make the roster as a gunner, special teams guy. If he makes the roster, all of a sudden that shrinks down the possibilities for who has a seat in the game of musical chairs in the wide receiver room, because you have to keep either Gunnar Olszewski or Isaiah McKenzie. If Miles Boykin is going to be specifically another special teams type player, you can only keep 4 maybe 5 other guys. And then that really limits who you can have. And I'm looking at a guy like, Isaiah Hodgins came back after not really getting any playing time last year. They signed the veteran Allen Robinson. They said, he could be a veteran guy in the room, could land on the practice squad, could be the last guy on the roster. To me, those guys are going to be fascinating to watch in this game against the Texans.
Yeah, I mean, we all know, right? Top four neighbors, Robinson, Slayton, and Hyatt. Those are the guys that are guaranteed. To your point, man, you bring up a guy like Miles Boykin, then I think you look at Bryce Ford Wheaton and you say, well, it's one or the other because they both have special teams value. But Bryce Ford Wheaton has been a guy that has a hard time staying healthy. Boykin is an experienced veteran player in that role. So how do they both look tomorrow? Certainly, you talk about Hodgins and Robinson. We've seen some of this going around now where it's like, hey, these are kind of head-to-head battles for roster spots inside of that wide receiver room. Same thing you mentioned about Gunner versus McKenzie. You're like, hey, these two guys, only one of you is coming with us. But even when you do that, you still end up getting down to the place where you say, well, it's Boykin, it's McKenzie, it's, let's just say, Hodgins, right? That's 3. And then you say the top 4. Well, now we're at 7. We're carrying 7 wide receivers. And if they have the special teams value, that's fantastic. But my curiosity becomes which one of those guys after the top 4 gives you the best version of another contributor inside of the offensive side of the football. And that's where I think the Hodgins and Robinson becomes really interesting and how many guys they choose to carry on this roster. One is incredibly experienced, has a long, lengthy career. Hodgins is obviously flash, but is also faded inside of the Giants organization in his time here so far. So that might be the 2 most important guys that you could watch tomorrow and say, handful of catches again for Robinson. I don't know. It feels weird to say he's making this roster, but maybe he is. And is Isaiah Hodgins the kind of guy that you couldn't just stash on your practice squad anyway? Is anyone clamoring for him if he doesn't make this roster?
Yeah, I mean, think about it. Last year, the New York Giants only kept 6 wide receivers during their initial cut. So we're already talking about adding one more. Keep in mind, when we talk about the quarterback room, Drew Lock is going to be available in case of emergency. It feels like Tommy DeVito is going to get a lot of work behind Daniel Jones. The Giants only kept 2 quarterbacks on their active roster. So, Adam, if you're saying, well, you got to keep Tommy DeVito, and clearly you need to keep 7 wide receivers, you're talking about 2 guys, 2 positions in specific rooms that weren't allocated to the 53 last season that now would have to be. That would mean one less person in the safety room, one less offensive lineman, one less defensive lineman, and you got to have that versatility with Azeez Ojulari. So for me, it's about how they're thinking about stacking this room. If they keep a fullback, talk about another roster spot that could go. If Jakob Johnson ends up making the roster and they keep 4 running backs on top of it, you're talking about 3 different roster spots that have to be reallocated across it. To me, that's fascinating to see how Tommy DeVito does and to see how those secondary wide receivers end up working out against the Texans.
Oh, yeah, of course. And I mean, right there, you talk about 3 QBs. Okay, now we're up to 10 with the wide receiver room. You're going to throw in another 4 in the running back room. You just start to add the numbers up. And you're like, oh, we certainly are stacking up towards halfway through our roster and getting towards the 53. It does make also, obviously, tomorrow. So as it stands right now, whether or not John Michael Schmitz maybe plays a rep or 2, but even if he does, it's going to be incredibly limited as he's coming back from the shoulder injury. So you're again going to see some of these depth players. John Runyon Jr., you're not going to get him out there necessarily. So now you start to talk about guys that are going to be fun to watch. And we saw a pretty good sample, especially in run protection a week ago against the Detroit Lions. Aaron Stinney is interesting to me. Obviously, you go a layer deeper with a young player like Kubis. How can he look? And then Schlottman is the other guy. I think that those are the 3 right now. Kajust has kind of come and gone in this conversation. Those 3 offensive linemen to me are the most interesting to watch because I can make the clearest connections to what the core of this depth looks like on the offensive line, understanding there's one other player on the right tackle position that we might want to keep an eye on because swing tackle, as of this moment, remains the biggest you tell me kind of discussion right now for the Giants this offseason.
Yeah, I mean, I was just waiting as you were going through the offensive line, and I'm like, when is he going to say it? When is he going to say it? Because much like Daniel Jones is a very polarizing quarterback for the New York Giants, what to do with Evan Neal feels just as polarizing, albeit not as an important position as quarterback. But some people are saying he should get cut. Some people are saying move him to guard. Some people are saying, well, his upside is tantalizing, and like you got to get him up to be able to be the starter. Some people are saying he should just be the backup right tackle. Other people are saying he should be the swing tackle and be able to play both positions. He's a guy that's fascinating. We have not seen him on the field in quite some time, Adam. So seeing him out there with live reps, presumably against second and third string guys, he has to look good. He has to look dominant. He has to look confident in that right tackle position, or else what are we doing? If Evan Neal can't perform well against third string guys, you're kind of sitting here saying, can he even make this roster at that point?
And if you talk about number of players there, because I agree with you, but I actually ended up stumbling into a question, right? 5 starters. Okay, give me those 3 guys: Stinney, Kubis, and Schlottman. Is that, are they guaranteed roster spots? Maybe not, but we're getting good buzz about them. Then you mentioned Evan Neal. That would be 9. And arguably, though, I think the real conversation here is, how does Evan Neal look? How does Joshua Ezeudu look? Because maybe that is in the wide receiver room. Maybe that's the head-to-head that's happening right now. Say a potential cut. Could they potentially cut Evan Neal? Well, if he looked bad enough, I think, yes, you potentially could. Can Ezeudu say, I'm the guy that you drafted a little bit higher that played guard, but you believed I had all the measurables to be a backup swing tackle? Can I confirm or deny that? Because it was a very mixed bag between run and pass protection for him. But then that's 10 bodies right there. And I just wonder, especially that position, I think you're talking about all these backups here for the Giants. You are battling, especially for swing tackle. You are not just battling the guys on the roster. You're battling the market, because the Giants do not see something they have a pretty strong confidence in this upcoming game and maybe the third game. But we know that's a diluted one now, even in the preseason. What is that going to mean as cuts start to happen? If you ask me right now, I'd say the backup swing tackle is somewhere else playing reps for another team, and the Giants are waiting for that opportunity.
Keep in mind, the Giants only kept 9 offensive linemen at the 53-man cut last year. You mentioned 10 guys. If they're keeping Tommy DeVito, they're keeping a wide receiver, they're keeping a
extra wide receiver, extra running back, extra offensive lineman, extra tight end. And what's the problem? We'll just keep all these guys.
Right. Like, where are all these positions coming from? And I say that tongue in cheek, because it's like, when you take from one place and give it to another, like, there's just not enough roster spots. So do they get thinner on the defensive side of the ball? I mean, all the things that we've mentioned, special teams / wide receiver, running back room / fullback, offensive line, these are all offensive positions. I am fascinated to see, this is going to be for a later show, but how are the Giants really going to be thinking about keeping this 53? And is there going to be a little bit of like weight more on the offense, knowing that there's still a lot of question marks? It remains to be seen how they're going to do that.
One other thing to watch here for me, there's one guy I want to make sure we touch on, because he's a young rookie and finally going to see some field time here too. When it comes to that wide receiver, when it comes to roster cuts, remember Darius Slayton has been getting used in special teams and return situations. I just don't know how much they're willing to risk him in that phase of the game and how good he looks. But I wonder if the number crunch comes down to, you're like, well, what's the version of this team where we're not keeping just pure special teams contributors, and we need to make sure that we have a little bit of dual ability here? If Jalen Hyatt continues to perform well, and you start to think that shift is happening with him and Darius Slayton, and who is the top receiver when it comes to getting on the field for reps, maybe you see that, and that opens up a different dynamic when it comes to some of these other conversations. You mentioned him briefly. I just wanted to make sure we highlighted Tyler Nubin getting on the field tomorrow is really, really important. Jalen Mills gets let go. They pay him over $400,000 to not be a part of the team. Now, all of a sudden, when you look in that room, listen, we have maybe an over affinity for Dane Belton on this podcast. We know what Jason Pinnock is going to be for you. We've seen some things. They brought in Raheem Lane as well. Is that just an innings eater? We'll find out. We've seen some things obviously flash over the years and over this camp, in terms of Javarius Owens, who's looked a little bit better last season, brought in. This season in camp looks stronger than he did in his rookie campaign. What is it, right? And if Tyler Nubin can come in there and go, guess what? My job. That changes a lot of how I look at this team and this defensive unit specifically, if he's ready to come in day one and be a key contributor, because I don't think, we'll talk about this on another episode, picks wasted or not, when it comes to Joe Shane. I just don't think that Dane Belton right now is looked at as a guy in the position that they want him to be the starter alongside Pinnock. More like he is the starter because they need someone else to take it. Tyler Newton would obviously be that guy.
Yeah, it feels like at the end of the day, Adam, Dane Belton is the guy because he was here last year. They want him to be there for the time being, considering Tyler Nubin has missed time. But you don't draft a safety in the second round to sit on the bench for very long. And while we like Dane Belton, it feels like there's a greater than 50% chance that at some point during the season that Tyler Nubin becomes the starter over Dane Belton. At least I believe that. And the question is, Does it happen earlier? Does it happen later? How much of an impact can Tyler Nubin, how quickly can Tyler Nubin play catch up to Dame Belton being in the building for a year and change more than him? That's what we're going to see once Tyler Nubin gets on the field. If you're like, whoa, that looks different, that'll give you your answer of how quickly he can ascend to being a starting safety for the Giants.
And by the way, in the hierarchy of this defensive scheme, maybe there's three safety versions because of the lack of necessarily trust you have in some of the secondary when it comes to these outside cornerbacks, right? So, hey, just show me good ball. That's what I'm hoping for. We get out the door. It was the end of the day. You can get us on YouTube. You can get us on your podcast feed, but my deep cut, the guy that showed up a little bit in that first preseason game, and I hope we continue to see it because it changes the linebacker dynamic as well. It's going to be my boy Darian Beavers. He's my little sneaky player in there that I have to make sure performs well. Do you have your deep cut guy that you want to see perform and make this roster?
My only other one that I will give a highlight of is Casey Rogers, defensive lineman, interior lineman. They obviously traded away Jordan Phillips. Elijah Chapman looks like he's a guy that's getting a lot of first team reps. But Casey Rogers is a guy, high motor. We talked about how like he was an All-American lacrosse player. Like he's clearly like an athlete at his big size and stature. I want to see more of him, and I think we're going to get more of him in this game. Curious to see what it looks like. I liked him when they made him like a priority signing in the site, the free agency period after the draft. Keep an eye out on him. The defensive line needs help, as you can tell. After Azeez Ojulari might even be playing there too.
Go ahead and enjoy the game tomorrow. 1 o'clock start. Fun little Saturday gig for everybody. And obviously, we'll be watching for who gets the number 1 reps and then who is brought in second and third, especially in a game like tomorrow, where that can give you a big indication about where they stand in the pecking order. We will be in on Monday, breaking it all down. Who knows? Maybe Sunday. We'll find out. But we'll be here. And we'll be talking about who looked good, who missed out, and who is probably getting closer to being cut as opposed to ascending up this depth chart. We will break that all down for you right here on One Giant Podcast. Andrew Makowitz, AMAC214, at Adam Armbrecht, and at One Giant Podcast on X. Until next time, until the best times. As Andrew Makowitz would want, need, and demand that people know.
As always, let's go Big Blue.